Hello, it's Aenslee Tanner here again, back with another Facebook Live video for you as part of my January Comfort Zone Stretching Challenge. And today I wanted to talk to you about something I think not enough people do. And it's proven game-changing in my own career, so I wanted to share that. And that's asking for feedback. Now, I acknowledge that asking for feedback can be uncomfortable. But I'm hoping that by sharing what I'm going to share with you today from my own experiences, it's going to help you want to decide to lean into that discomfort a little bit more, because there can be a lot of gold in there. Okay, so I consider myself, for those who might think that I'm some kind of like super thick-skinned person, just to let you know, I consider myself actually quite highly sensitive. So it's not been a painless process for me, I'm not gonna lie, but let me tell you why I've found it so useful and why I've done it so often in my career. So there was a point when I was doing my first career pivot, when I was moving from engineering to public policy, very different fields, and I was failing a lot in my job application process, sending my engineering resumes basically to policy jobs. Wasn't getting me a lot of callbacks. So I went through, I got some feedback on my my application process, which is a story I can share another time. But that led to me finally starting to get some interviews. And even once I start getting those interviews, I wasn't having a lot of success at getting a role. So I finally decided, well, I need to figure out what's going wrong here. So I made it a habit after every interview to follow up and ask for feedback to get a perspective on what's how they perceived the interaction, how the interview went. And not everybody says yes. Not everybody has time. Not everybody feels comfortable. Not everybody feels like they have something useful to offer. But there was a time when somebody did say yes. And I had the chance to go in and sit down with them after the interview and ask them, how it went from their perspective. And direct quote, they said, "You're the most boring person we've ever interviewed." And that hit me in my gut. I'm not gonna lie. But I just responded by saying, okay, thank you for sharing that. Can you tell me more about that? And here's what I learned from that. I had gone into this interview. I was super excited about the possibility of getting this role. So excited about moving into policy, and so I had coached myself right before the interview to just stay calm. Be deliberate in your answers, just be, really composed, and let them know that you've got what it takes to be able to do this job, right? Well, what I thought was coming across as being deliberate and thoughtful and poised was being perceived on the other side as being boring. So the interviewer explained to me, she said, "Look, we asked you a question, and then there was this long silence, and we didn't know, like, did you even hear us? Like, are you on another planet? Like, why is it taking you so long to respond? We're feeling awkward." So she gave me all this valuable insight into, this is how I'm being perceived. So what I realized was it didn't really matter what I thought, what my intention was to come across as thoughtful, right? Because they were perceiving it as awkward and boring. And that was valuable insight for me, because I walked away from that learning, in an interview, it's not just about the content of my answers. It's actually, how am I making my counterpart feel? How are we interacting? Is this an enjoyable conversation for them, right? So that completely transformed the way that I looked at an interview, right? It became almost overnight, like much more of a two-way process for me. I also got another takeaway from that, and that was, okay, I'm introverted, right? I've spoken about this before. I'm not somebody who can really think and talk at the same time. I like to pause and give myself time to process. But that's not the same for everybody, especially a lot of extroverts out there, right? Talking is the processing for some people. So I had to really stake a claim and say, take ownership of my thinking process, and do it in a way that was comfortable for the other party. I'll give you a couple of examples. So in an interview situation, what I started doing was to buy myself time. If it was, like a really thought-provoking policy question that I was or scenario that I was being asked to contemplate, I would say, oh, that's a big question. I'm just going to have to think about that for a moment, and then I at least set the scene to let them know to expect that I'm going to pause here. So you understand, I've taken on board what you said, and I'm processing it, and I'm going to come back to you with an answer shortly. So that was one way that I bought myself time. But also equally in another situation where I was on a conference call, and there were lots of perspectives being shared, and really difficult topic, and I'm trying to follow the conversation. Suddenly, somebody asks on the other end of the phone, Aenslee, what do you think? And I had, the wheels were turning in my head, and I just, before taking my pause to process, I just simply let everybody on the phone know that we've, a lot of ideas have been shared. I'm just gonna, I'm still processing. Just give me a moment. I just stake that claim to say, look, I just need a moment to think this through, and I'm coming back to you, right? So that people don't feel like they're left hanging. So it's just about managing expectations too. So this completely transformed things for me. I was much more successful with my interviews after that, once I adopted that, and it was all because I was willing to ask for feedback, right? So it was uncomfortable in the moment, but I got so much gold out of it. So really valuable tool. I want to emphasize, maybe as like a little bit of a reframe for you, that it's not about the feedback giver necessarily being right or wrong. Their perspective is their perspective. It just is what it is, right? For whatever reason, that's how they've taken what you've done or how you've come across, right? So I think it's more beneficial to think about feedback in terms of useful, not useful, rather than, right or wrong. And useful feedback would be something that you can learn from, that you've gotten the context to understand where the feedback giver is coming from, and where you walk away with something specific and actionable that you can do, right, to change the result, right? Not useful feedback would be something kind of like a blanket statement, for example, of you did a bad job, or this report sucks, or something like that. Okay, thanks for sharing, but what am I supposed to do with that? Like, what about it wasn't good, wasn't up to par, right? So that's not particularly useful. You don't know what to do after that to change the game. So my recommendation to you in terms of how you might get some useful feedback that you can work with in the future is simply to start with gratitude. In the moment, as much as it might sting, to say something like, thank you for sharing, or thank you for your honesty. Because it's not always easy, right, for the feedback giver to give you not great news, right? So to acknowledge them can really be beneficial, for their sharing. Then you could ask something like, could you tell me more about that? I'd really like to understand where you're coming from. Could you give me some more insight into why you see things that way? Right? And dig a little bit deeper, right? So if they've just said, the quality of this report wasn't what it needed to be. Okay, thank you. Could you help me understand, like, what was it specifically that wasn't up to par? A lot of people, when they're asking for feedback, I think make a mistake when they just sit down and say, could you give me some feedback? Or what do you think, how do you think I did? I think that's a very difficult question for somebody to answer usefully. And it invites almost like a personal attack. Whereas if you reframe it to say something like, what would you recommend I try differently next time to make either the output or outcome or the process even better? What you're doing when you ask for feedback in that kind of a way is you've set the terms. You've said, you've invited input from the other party, but you've said, give me something specific that I can implement going forward that will improve this. So rather than inviting a list of complaints, you're inviting some proactive forward thinking, feed forward, to use a term from Marshall Goldsmith, to give you something actually useful that you might be able to implement going forward. I'd also encourage you, when it comes to feedback, it's up to you what you want to take on board and what you want to leave behind, right? There might be some things where somebody gives you feedback, you think, honestly, I think they're really off base. Cool. Thank them for their contribution. You can shelve it. You know, it's their perspective, right? Not about right or wrong. It's their perspective. It is what it is. I hope you found that useful. I encourage you to lean into that discomfort, to ask for feedback. Like I said, I found it game-changing in my own career, and I hope it's beneficial for you too. I wish you all the best, and I'll see you back in another video shortly.